Hi. Mm, we continued our adventure. We um, had just stopped by an island that they landed in and found some cannibals, and they ran away. And now they continued their journey. Not sure to where. Let's go find out. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. See. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Chapter 22. Aegrisomnia. The following day, 10th of January, the Nautilus continued her course between two seas, but with such remarkable speed that I could not estimate it at less than 35 miles an hour. The rapidity of her screw was such that I could neither follow nor count its revolutions. When I reflected that this marvelous electric agent, after having afforded motion, heat, and light to the Nautilus, still protected her from outward attack and transformed her into an ark of safety, which no profane hand might touch without being thunderstricken, my admiration was unbounded, and from the structure it extended to the engineer who had called it into existence. Our course was directed to the west, and on 11th January we doubled Cape Vessel, situated in 135 degrees longitude and 10 degrees north latitude, which forms the cast point of the Gulf of Carpentaria. The reefs were still numerous, but more equalized, and marked on the chart with extreme precision. The Nautilus easily avoided the breakers of Monet to port and the Victoria Reefs to starboard, placed at 130 degrees longitude and on the 10th parallel, which we strictly followed. On the 13th of January, Captain Nemo arrived in the Sea of Timor and recognized the island of that name in 122 degrees longitude. From this point, the direction of the Nautilus inclined towards the southwest. Her head was set for the Indian Ocean. Where would the fancy of Captain Nemo carry us next? Would we return to the coast of Asia? Improbable conjectures both, for a man who fled from inhabited continents. Then, would he descend to the south? Was he going to double the Cape of Good Hope, then Cape Horn, and finally go as far as the Antarctic Pole? Would he come back at last to the Pacific, where his Nautilus could sail free and independently? Time would show. After having skirted the sands of Cartier, of Hibernia, Seringapatam, and Scott, last efforts of the solid against the liquid element, on the 14th of January we lost sight of land altogether. The speed of the Nautilus was considerably abated and, with a regular course, she sometimes swam in the bosom of the waters, sometimes floated on their surface. During this period of the voyage, Captain Nemo made some interesting experiments on the varied temperature of the sea in different beds. Under ordinary conditions, these observations are made by means of rather complicated instruments and with somewhat doubtful results, by means of thermometrical sounding leads, the glasses often breaking under the pressure of the water, or an apparatus grounded on the variations of the resistance of metals to the electric current. Mm. Results so obtained could not be correctly calculated. On the contrary, Captain Nemo went himself to test the temperature in the depths of the sea, and his thermometer, placed in communication with the different sheets of water, gave him the required degree immediately and accurately. It was thus that, either by overloading her reservoirs, or by descending obliquely by means of her inclined planes, the Nautilus successively attained a depth of 3, 4, 5, 7, 9, and 10,000 yards, and by the definite result of this experience was that the sea preserved an average temperature of 4 degrees and a half at a depth of 5,000 fathoms under all latitudes. On the 16th of January, the Nautilus seemed becalmed, only a few yards beneath the surface of the waves. Her electric apparatus remained inactive, and her motionless crew left her to drift at the mercy of the currents. I suppose that the crew was occupied with interior repairs, rendered necessary by the violence of the mechanical movements of the machine. My companions and I then witnessed a curious spectacle. The hatches of the saloon were open, and as the beacon light of the Nautilus was not in action, a dim obscurity reigned in the midst of the waters. I observed the state of the sea under these conditions, and the largest fish appeared to me no more than scarcely defined shadows, when the Nautilus found herself suddenly transported into full light. I thought at first that the beacon had been lighted and was casting its electric radiance into the liquid mass. I was mistaken, and after a rapid survey, perceived my error. The Nautilus floated in the midst of a phosphorescent bed, which, in this obscurity, became quite dazzling. It was produced by myriads of luminous animalculae, whose brilliancy was increased as they glided over the metallic hull of the vessel. I was surprised by lightning in the midst of these luminous sheets, as though they had been rivulets of lead melted in an ardent furnace, or metallic masses brought to a white heat, so that, by force of contrast, certain portions of light appeared to cast a shade in the midst of the general ignition, from which all shade seemed banished. No, this was not the calm radiation of ordinary lightning. There was unusual life and vigor. This was truly living light. In reality, it was an infinite agglomeration of colored infusoria, of veritable globules of the diaphanous jelly, provided with a thread-like tentacle, and of which as many as 25,000 have been counted in less than 2 cubic half-inches of water, and their light was increased by the glimmering peculiar to the medusae, starfish, aurelia, and other phosphorescent zoophytes, impregnated by degrees of the organic matter decomposed by the sea, and, perhaps, the mucus secreted by the fish. During several hours the Nautilus floated in these brilliant waves, and our admiration increased as we watched the marine monsters disporting themselves like salamanders. I saw there, in the midst of this fire that burns not, this swift and elegant porpoise, the the indefatigable clown of the ocean, and some swordfish, 10 feet long, those prophetic heralds of the hurricane, whose formidable sword will now and then strike the glass of the saloon. Then appeared the smaller fish, the variegated ballista, the leaping mackerel, wolf turntails, and 100 others which striped the luminous atmosphere as they swam. This dazzling spectacle was enchanting. Perhaps some atmospheric condition increased the intensity of this phenomenon. Perhaps some storm agitated the surface of the waves. But at this depth of some yards, the Nautilus was unmoved by its fury, and reposed peacefully in still water. So we progressed, incessantly charmed by some new marvel. Conseil arranged and classed his zoophytes, his articulata, his mollusks, his fishes. The days passed rapidly away, and I took no account of them. Ned, according to habit, tried to vary the diet on board. Like snails, we were fixed to our shells, and I declare it is easy to lead a snail's life. Thus this life seemed easy and natural, and we thought no longer of the life we led on land, but something happened to recall us to the strangeness of our situation. On the 18th of January, the Nautilus was in 105 degrees longitude and 15 degrees south latitude. The weather was threatening, the sea rough and rolling. There was a strong east wind. The barometer, which had been going down for some days, foreboded a coming storm. I went up on the platform just as the second lieutenant was taking the measure of the horary angles, and waited, according to habit, till the daily phase was said. But on this day it was exchanged for another phrase not less incomprehensible. Almost directly I saw Captain Nemo appear, with a glass, looking towards the horizon. For some minutes he was unmovable, without taking his eye off the point of observation. Then he lowered his glass and exchanged a few words with his lieutenant. The latter seemed to be a victim of some emotion that he tried in vain to repress. Captain Nemo, having more command over himself, was cool. He seemed, too, to be making some objections, to which the lieutenant replied by formal assurances. At least I concluded so by the difference of their tones and gestures. For myself, I had looked carefully in the direction indicated, without seeing anything. The sky and water were lost in the clear line of the horizon. However, Captain Nemo walked from one end of the platform to the other, without looking at me, perhaps without seeing me. His step was firm, but less regular than usual. He stopped sometimes, crossed his arms, and observed the sea. What could he be looking for on that immense expanse? The Nautilus was then some hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. lieutenant had taken up the glass and examined the horizon steadfastly, going and coming, stamping his foot and showing more nervous agitation than his superior officer. Besides, this mystery must necessarily be solved, and before long, for, upon an order from Captain Nemo, the engine, increasing its propelling power, made the screw turn more rapidly. Just then, the lieutenant drew the captain's attention again. The latter stopped walking and directed his glass towards the place indicated. He looked long. I felt very much puzzled and descended to the drawing room and took out an excellent telescope that I generally used. Then, leaning on the edge of the watchlight that jutted out from the front of the platform, set myself to look over all the line of the sky and sea. But my eye was no sooner applied to the glass than it was quickly snatched out of my hands. I turned round. Captain Nemo was before me, but I did not know him. His face was transfigured, his eyes flashed suddenly, his teeth were set, his stiff body, clenched fists, and head shrunk between his shoulders, betrayed the violent agitation that pervaded his whole frame. He did not move. My glass, fallen from his hands, had rolled at his feet. Had I unwittingly provoked his fit or anger? Did this incomprehensible person imagine that I had discovered some forbidden secret? No, I was not the object of his hatred, for he was not looking at me. His eye was steadily fixed upon the impenetrable point of the horizon. At last, Captain Nemo recovered himself. His agitation subsided. He addressed some words in a foreign language to his lieutenant, that turned to me. Hi there, oh, is it with all of you wanting pets when I cannot pet you? No, that is a cool name. It sounds. I think I've heard of that before. Uh, that is a cool name. So there is your word pat. Pat, pat. Now, welcome. At last, Captain Nemo recovered himself. His agitation subsided. He addressed some words in a foreign language to his lieutenant, then turned to me. "Mr. Aronnax," he said, in rather an imperious tone, "I require you to keep one of the conditions that bind you to me." "What is it, Captain?" "You must be confined with your companions until I think fit to release you." "You are the master," I replied, looking steadily at him. "But may I ask you one question?" "None, sir." There was no resisting to his imperious command. It would have been useless. I went down to the cabin occupied by Ned Land and Conseil, and told them the captain's determination. You may judge how his communication was received by the Canadian. But there was no time for altercation. 4 of the 5 of the crew waited at the door, and conducted us to that cell where we had passed our first night on board the Nautilus. Ned Land would have remonstrated, but the door was shut upon him. "Will master tell me what this means?" asked Conseil. I told my companions what had passed. They were as much astonished as I, and equally at a loss how to account for it. Meanwhile, I was absorbed in my own reflections, and could think of nothing but the strange fear depicted in Captain's countenance. I was utterly at a loss to account for it, when my cogitations were disturbed by these words from Ned Land. "Hello, breakfast is ready." And indeed the table was laid. Evidently Captain Nemo had given this order at the same time that he had hastened the speed of the Nautilus. "Will master permit me to make a recommendation?" asked Conseil. "Yes, my boy." "Well, it is that master breakfast. It is prudent, for we do not know what may happen. You are right, Conseil." "Unfortunately," said Ned Land, "they have only given us the ship's fare." "Friend Ned," asked Conseil, "what would you have said if the breakfast had been entirely forgotten?" This argument cut short the harpooner's recriminations. We sat down to table. The meal was eaten in silence. Just then the luminous globe that lighted the cell went out and left us in total darkness. Ned Land was soon asleep, and what astonished me was that Conseil went off into a heavy sleep. I was thinking what could have caused his irresistible drowsiness, when I felt my brain becoming stupefied. In spite of my efforts to keep my eyes open, they would close. A painful suspicion seized me. Evidently soporific substances had been mixed with the food we had just taken. Imprisonment was not enough to conceal Captain Nemo's projects from us. Sleep was more necessary. I then heard the panels shut. The undulations of the sea, which caused a slight rolling motion, ceased. Had the Nautilus quitted the surface of the ocean? Had it gone back to the motionless bed of water? I tried to resist sleep. It was impossible. My breathing grew weak. I felt a mortal cold freeze my stiffened and half-paralyzed limbs. My eyelids, like leaden caps, fell over my eyes. I could not raise them. A morbid sleep, full of hallucinations, bereft me of my being. Then the visions disappeared and left me in complete insensibility. Chapter 23: The Coral Kingdom. The next day I woke with my head singularly clear. To my great surprise, I was in my own room. My companions, no doubt, had been reinstated in their cabin, without having perceived it any more than I. Of what had passed during the night they were as ignorant as I was, and to penetrate this mystery I only reckoned upon the chances of the future. I then thought of quitting my room. Was I free again, or a prisoner? Quite free. I opened the door, went to the half-deck, went up to the central stairs. The panels, shut the evening before, were open. I went on to the platform. Ned Land and Conseil waited there for me. I questioned them. They knew nothing. Lost in a heavy sleep in which they had been totally unconscious, they had been astonished at finding themselves in their cabin. As for the Nautilus, it seemed quiet and mysterious as ever. It floated on the surface of the waves at a moderate pace. Nothing seemed changed on board. The second lieutenant then came onto the platform and gave the usual order below. As for Captain Nemo, he did not appear. Did not appear. Did they stop? There. Of the people on board, I only saw the impassible steward, who served me with his usual dumb regularity. About 2 o'clock, I was in the drawing room, busied in arranging my notes, when the captain opened the door and appeared. I bowed. He made a slight inclination in return, without speaking. I resumed my work, hoping that he would perhaps give me some explanation of the events of the preceding night. He made none. I looked at him. He seemed fatigued. His heavy eyes had not been refreshed by sleep. His face looked very sorrowful. He walked to and from, sat down and got up again, took up a chess book, put it down, consulted his instruments without taking his habitual notes, and seemed restless and uneasy. At last he came up to me and said, "Are you a doctor, Mr. Aronnax?" I so little expected such a question that I stared some time at him without answering. "Are you a doctor?" he repeated. "Several of your colleagues have studied medicine." "Well," said I am a doctor and resident surgeon to the hospital. I practiced several years before entering the museum." "Very well, sir." My answer had evidently satisfied the captain, but not knowing what he would say next, I waited for other questions, reserving my answers according to circumstances. "Mr. Aronnax, will you consent to prescribe for one of my men?" he asked. "Is he ill?" "Yes." "I am ready to follow you." "Come, then." I own my heart beat. I do not know why. I saw a certain connection between the illness of one of the crew and the events of the day before, and this mystery interested me at least as much as the sick man. Captain Nemo conducted me to the poop of the Nautilus, and took me into a cabin situated near the sailors' quarters. There, on a bed, lay a man about 40 years of age, with a resolute expression of countenance, a true type of an Anglo-Saxon. I leant over him. He was not only ill, he was wounded. His head, swathed in bandages covered with blood, lay on a pillow. I undid the bandages, and the wounded man looked at me with his large eyes and gave no sign of pain as I did it. It was a horrible wound. The skull, shattered by some deadly weapon, left the brain exposed, which was much injured. Clots of blood had formed in the bruised and broken mass, in color like the dregs of wine. There was both contusion and suffusion of the brain. His breathing was slow, and some spasmodic movements of the muscles agitated his face. I felt his pulse. It was intermittent. The extremities of the body were growing cold already, and I saw death must inevitably ensue. After dressing the unfortunate man's wounds, I readjusted the bandage on his head and turned to Captain Nemo. "What caused this wound?" I asked. What does it signify? He replied evasively. A shock has broken one of the levers of the engine, which struck myself. But your opinion as to his state? I hesitated before giving it. You may speak, said the captain. This man does not understand French. I gave a last look at the wounded man. He will be dead in 2 hours. Can nothing save him? Nothing. Captain Nemo's hand contracted, and some tears glistened in his eyes, which I thought incapable of shedding any. For some moments I still watched the dying man, whose life ebbed slowly. His pallor increased under the electric light that shed over his deathbed. I looked at his intelligent forehead, furrowed with premature wrinkles, produced probably by misfortune and sorrow. I tried to learn the secret of his life from the last words that escaped his lips. You can go now, Mr. Aronnax, said the captain. I left him in the dying man's cabin and returned to my room, much affected by this scene. During the whole day I was haunted by uncomfortable suspicions, and at night I slept badly, and between my broken dreams I fancied I heard distant sighs like the notes of a funeral psalm. Were they the prayers of the dead, murmurs in that language that I could not understand? The next morning I went on the bridge. Captain Nemo was there before me. As soon as he perceived me, he came to me. Professor, would it be convenient to you to make a submarine excursion today? With my companions, I asked, if they like. We obey your orders, Captain. We will be so good then as to put on your cork jackets? Oh, hey there, Toya. How are you doing? It was not a question of death or dying. I rejoined Ned Land and Conseil and told them of Captain Nemo's proposition. Conseil hastened to accept it, and this time the Canadians seemed quite willing to follow our example. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. At 8:30 we were equipped for this new excursion, and provided with two contrivances for light and breathing. The double door was open, and accompanied by Captain Nemo, who was followed by a dozen of the crew, we set foot, at a depth of about 30 feet, on the solid bottom on which the Nautilus rested. Doing good? Ah, that's good, that's great. And I'm fine as well. Book reading is always very relaxing. A slight declivity ended in an uneven bottom at 15 fathoms deep. This bottom differed entirely from the one I had visited on my first excursion under the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Here there was no fine sand, no submarine prairies, no sea forest. I immediately recognized that marvelous region in which, on that day, the captain did the honors to us. It was the Coral Kingdom. In the zoophyte branch and in the Alcyon class I noticed the Gorgonae, the Isidiae, and the corollary. The light produced 1,000 charming varieties, playing in the midst of the branches that were so vividly colored. I seemed to see the membranous and cylindrical tubes tremble beneath the undulation of the waters. I was tempted to gather their fresh petals, ornamented with delicate tentacles, some just blown, the others budding, while small fish swimming swiftly touched them slightly, the flights of birds, like flights of birds. But if my hand approached these living flowers, these animated, sensitive plants, the whole colony took alarm. The white petals re-entered in their red cases, the flowers faded as I looked, and the bush changed into a block of stone knobs. Chance had thrown me just by the most precious specimens of the zoophyte. This coral was more valuable than that found in the Mediterranean, on the coast of France, Italy, and Barbary. Its tints justified the poetical names of flower of blood and froth of blood. That trade was given to its most beautiful productions. These seem like very nice flowers indeed. Coral is sold for 20 euros per ounce, and in this place the watery beds would make the fortunes of a company of coral divers. This precious matter, often confused with other polypi, formed then the inextricable plots called macciota, and on which I noticed several beautiful specimens of pink coral. But soon the bushes contract, and the arborizations increase. Real petrified thickets, long joists of fantastic architecture were disclosed before us. Captain Nemo placed himself under a dark gallery, where, by a slight declivity, we reached a depth of 100 yards. The light from our lamps produced sometimes magical effects, following the rough outlines of the natural arches, and pendants disposed like lustres that were tipped with points of fire. Between the coralline shrubs I noticed other polypi, not less curious, coralline melids and irises with articulated ramifications. Also some tufts of coral, some green, others red, like seaweed, encrusted in their calcareous salts, that naturalists, after long discussion, have definitely classed in the vegetable kingdom. But following the remarks of a thinking man, there is perhaps the real point where life rises obscurely from the slip of a stone, without detaching itself from the half point of departure. At last, after walking 2 hours, we had attained a depth of about 300 yards. That is to say, the extreme limit on which coral begins to form. But there was no isolated bush, nor modest brushwood at the bottom of lofty trees. It was an immense forest of large mineral vegetations, enormous petrified trees, united by garlands of elegant plumarias, sea-bind weed, all adorned with clouds and reflections. We passed freely under their high branches, lost in the shade of the waves, while at our feet tubby spores, meanderings, stars, fungi, and Caryophyllidea formed a carpet of flowers, sewn with dazzling gems. What an indescribable spectacle! Captain Nemo had stopped. I and my companions halted, and turning around, I saw his men were forming a semicircle round their chief. Watching attentively, I observed that 4 of them carried on their shoulders an object of an oblong shape. We occupied in this place the center of a vast glade surrounded by the lofty foliage of the submarine forest. Our lamps threw over this place a sort of clear twilight that singularly elongated the shadows of the ground. At the end of the glade the darkness increased, and was only relieved by little sparks reflected by the points of coral. Ned Land and Conseil were near me. We watched, and I thought I was going to witness a strange scene. On observing the ground, I saw that it was raised in certain places by slight excrescences encrusted with limy deposits, and disposed with a regularity that betrayed the hand of man. In the midst of the glade, on a pedestal of rocks roughly piled up, stood a cross of coral that extended its long arms, that one might have thought were made of petrified blood. Upon a sign from Captain Nemo, one of the men advanced, and at some feet from the cross he began to dig a hole with a pickaxe that he took from his belt. I understood all. This glade was a cemetery, this hole a tomb, this oblong object the body of the man who had died in the night. The captain and his men had come to bury their companion in this general resting place at the bottom of this inaccessible ocean. The grave was being dug slowly. The fish fled on all sides where their retreat was being thus disturbed. Seems like a very peaceful resting place. I'd like something like that. I heard the strokes of the pickaxe which sparkled when it hit some flint lost at the bottom of the waters. The hole was soon large and deep enough to receive the body. Then the bearers approached. The body, enveloped in a tissue of white byssus, was lowered into the damp grave. Captain Nemo, with his arms crossed on his breasts, and all the friends of him who had loved them, knelt in prayer. The grave was then filled in with some rubbish taken from the ground, which formed a slight mound. When this was done, Captain Nemo and his men rose. Then, approaching the grave, they knelt again, and now extended their hands in a sign of a last adieu. Then the funeral procession returned to the Nautilus, passing under the arches of the forest, in the midst of thickets, along the coral bushes, and still on the ascent. At last the fires on board appeared, and their luminous track guided us to the Nautilus. At 1 o'clock we had returned. As soon as I had changed my clothes, I went up to the platform, and, a prey to conflicting emotions, I sat down near the binnacle. Captain Nemo joined me. I rose and said to him, "So, as I said he would, this man died in the night." "Yes, Mr. Aronnax." "And we rest now, near his companions, in the coral cemetery?" "Yes, forgotten by all else, but not by us. We dug the grave, and the Polyphy undertake to seal our dead for eternity. And burying his face quickly in his hands, he tried in vain to suppress a sob. Then he added, "Our peaceful cemetery is there, some 100 feet below the surface of the waves. Your dead sleep quietly, at least, Captain, out of the reach of sharks." "Yes, sir, of sharks and men," gravely replied the captain. Part 2, Chapter 1, The Indian Ocean. It is always sad when you lose some of your crewmates. We now come to the second part of our journey under the sea. The first ended with the moving scene in the coral cemetery, which left such a deep impression on my mind. Thus, in the midst of this great sea, Captain Nemo's life was passing even to his grave, which he had prepared in one of its deepest abysses. There, not one of the captain's monsters, not one of the ocean's monsters could trouble the last sleep of the crew of the Nautilus, of those friends riveted to each other in death as in life. Nor any man either, had added the captain, still the same fierce, implacable defiance towards human society. I could no longer content myself with the hypothesis which satisfied Conseil. That worthy fellow persisted in seeing the commander of the Nautilus one of those unknown savants who return mankind contempt for indifference. For him, he was a misunderstood genius who, tired of Earth's deceptions, had taken refuge in this inaccessible medium, where he might follow his instincts freely. To my mind, this hypothesis explained but one side of Captain Nemo's character. Indeed, the mystery of that last night during which we had been chained in prison, the sleep and the precaution so violently taken by the captain of snatching from my eyes the glass I had raised to sweep the horizon, the mortal wound of the man due to an unaccountable shock of the Nautilus, all put me on a new track. No, Captain Nemo was not satisfied with shunning man. His formidable apparatus not only suited this instinct of freedom, but perhaps also the design of some terrible retaliation. At this moment nothing is clear to me. I catch but a glimpse of light amidst all the darkness, and I must confine myself to writing as events shall dictate. That day, on the 24th of January, 1868, at noon, the second officer came to take the altitude of the sun. I mounted the platform, lit a cigar, and watched the operation. It seemed to me that the man did not understand French, for several times I made remarks in a loud voice, which must have drawn from him some involuntary sign of attention if he had understood them, but he remained undisturbed and dumb. As he was taking observations with the sextant, one of the sailors of the Nautilus, The strong man who had accompanied us on our first submarine excursion to the island of Crespo came to clean the glasses of the lantern. I examined the fittings of the apparatus, the strength of which was increased 100-fold by lenticular rings, placed similar to those in a lighthouse, and which projected their brilliance in a horizontal plane. The electric lamp was combined in such a way as to give its most powerful light. Indeed, it was produced in vacuo, which ensured both its steadiness and its intensity. This vacuum economized the graphite points between which the luminous ore was developed, an important point of economy for Captain Nemo, who could not easily have replaced them, and under these conditions their waste was imperceptible. When the Nautilus was ready to continue its submarine journey, I went down to the saloon. The panels were closed, and the course marked direct west. We were furrowing the waters of the Indian Ocean, a vast liquid plain with a surface of 1,200,000,000,000 of acres, and whose waters are so clear and transparent that anyone leaning over them would turn giddy. The Nautilus usually floated between 50 and 100 fathoms deep. We went on so for some days. To anyone but myself, who had a great love for the sea, the hours would have seemed long and monotonous. But the daily walks on the platform, when I steeped myself in the reviving air of the ocean, the sight of the rich waters through the windows of the saloon, the books in the library, the compiling of my memoirs, took up all my time, and left me not a moment of ennui or weariness. For some days we saw a great number of aquatic birds, sea mews or gulls. Some were cleverly killed and prepared in a certain way, made very acceptable water game. Amongst large winged birds carried a long distance from all lands, and resting upon the waves from the fatigue of their flight, I saw some magnificent albatrosses, uttering discordant cries, like the braying of an ass, and birds belonging to the family of the Longipennes. The family of the Totipalmates was represented by the sea swallows, which caught the fish from the surface, and by numerous phaetons or lepturi, amongst others, the phaeton with red lines as large as a pigeon, whose white plumage, tinted with pink, shows off to advantage the blackness of its wings. As to the fish, they always provoked our admiration, and we surprised the secrets of their aquatic life through the open panels. I saw many kinds which I never before had the chance of observing. I shall notice chiefly ostracions peculiar to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and that part which washes the coast of tropical America. These fishes, like the tortoise, the armadillo, the sea hedgehog, and the crustacea, are protected by a breastplate which is neither chalky nor stony, but real bone. In some, it takes the form of a solid triangle, in others of a solid quadrangle. Amongst the triangular, I saw some and an inch and a half in length, with wholesome flesh and a delicious flavor. They are brown at the tail and yellow at the fins, and they recommend their introduction into fresh water, to which a certain number of sea fish easily accustom themselves. I would also mention quadrangular ostracions, having on the back 4 large tubercles, some dotted over with white spots on the lower part of the body, and which may be tamed like birds. Trigos provided with spikes formed by the lengthening of their bony shell, and which, from their strange grunts, are called sea pigs. Also dromedaries with large humps in the shape of a cone, whose flesh is very tough and leathery. I now borrow from the daily notes of Master Consul certain fish of the genus Petrodon peculiar to those seas, with red backs and white chests, which are distinguished by 3 rows of longitudinal filaments, and some electrical 7 inches long, decked in the liveliest colors. Then, as specimens of other kinds, some ovoids resembling an egg of a dark brown color, marked with white bands, and without tails, diodons, real sea porcupines, furnished with spikes and capable of swelling in such a way as to look like cushions bristling with darts. Hippocampi, common to every ocean, some pegasi with lengthened snouts, which their pectoral fins, being much elongated and formed in the shape of wings, allow, if not to fly, at least to shoot into the air. Pigeon spatulae, with tails covered with many rings of shell. Macrognathi with long jaws, an excellent fish, 9 inches long and bright with most agreeable colors. Pale-colored calliomores with rugged heads, and plenty of chaetodrons with long and tubular muzzles, which kill insects by shooting them, as from an air gun, with a single drop of water. These we may call the flycatchers of the seas. I will take a really quick break. I need to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back. So continuing, Council really does love classifying stuff. Although I wish we could see more of what they're up to and a little less of all the details of the things they find. So let's continue. In the 8th nymph genus of fishes, classed by Lacepede, belonging to the second lower class of bony, characterized by opercles and bronchial membranes, I remarked the Scorpina, the head of which is furnished with spikes, and which has but one dorsal fin. These creatures are covered or not with little shells, according to the subclass in which they belong. The second subclass gives us specimens of Didactylus 14 or 15 inches in length, with yellow rays and heads of a most fantastic appearance. As to the first subclass, it gives several specimens of that singular-looking fish, appropriately called a sea frog, with large head, sometimes pierced with holes, sometimes swollen with protuberances, bristling with spikes, and covered with tubercles. It has irregular and hideous horns. Its body and tail are covered with callosities. Its sting makes a dangerous wound. It is both repugnant and horrible to look at. From the 21st to the 23rd of January, the Nautilus went at the rate of 250 leagues in 24 hours, being 540 miles or 22 miles an hour. If we recognized so many different varieties of fish, it was because, attracted by the electric light, they tried to follow us. The greater part, however, were soon distanced by our speed, though some kept their place in the waters of the Nautilus for a time. The morning of the 24th, in 12 degrees 5 south latitude and 94 degrees 33 longitude, we observed Killing Island, a madrepore formation, planted with magnificent cocoas, and which had been visited by Mr. Darwin and Captain Fitzroy. The Nautilus skirted the shores of this desert island for a little distance. Its nets brought up numerous specimens of polypi and curious shells of mollusca. Some precious productions of the species of Delphinulae enriched the treasures of Captain Nemo, to which I added an Astraea punctifera, a kind of parasite polypus often found fixed to a shell. Soon Killing Island disappeared from the horizon, and our course was directed to the northwest in the direction of the Indian Peninsula. From Killing Island, our course was slower and more variable, often taking us into great depths. Several times they made use of the inclined planes, with certain internal levers placed obliquely to the waterline. In that way we went about 2 miles, but without ever obtaining the greatest depths of the Indian Sea, which soundings of 7,000 fathoms had never reached. As to the temperature of the lower strata, the thermometer invariably indicated 4 degrees above zero. I only observed that in the upper regions the water was always colder in the high levels than at the surface of the sea. On the 24th of January, the ocean was entirely deserted. The Nautilus passed the day on the surface, beating the waves with its powerful screw and making them rebound to a great height. Who under such circumstances would not have taken it for a gigantic cetacean? 3 parts of this day I spent on the platform. I watched the sea, nothing on the horizon, till about 4 o'clock, a steamer running west on our counter. Her masts were visible for an instant, but she could not see the Nautilus, being too low in the water. I fancied this steamboat belonged to the P.O. Company, which runs from Ceylon to Sydney, touching at King George's Point and Melbourne. At 5 o'clock in the evening, before that fleeting twilight which binds night to day in tropical zones, Conseil and I were astonished by a curious spectacle. It was a show of Argonauts travelling along on the surface of the ocean. We could count several hundreds. They belonged to the tubercle kind which are peculiar to the Indian seas. These graceful molluscs moved backwards by means of their locomotive tube, through which they propelled the water already drowning. Of their 8 tentacles, 6 were elongated and stretched out floating on the water, whilst the other 2, rolled up flat, were spread to the wind like a light sail. I saw their spiral-shaped and fluted shells, which Cuvier justly compares to an elegant skiff. A boat, indeed, it bears the creature which secretes without its adhering to it. For nearly an hour the Nautilus floated in the midst of this show of molluscs. Then I know not what sudden fright they took, but as if at a signal, every sail was furled, the arms folded, the body drawn in, the shells turned over, changing their center of gravity, and the whole fleet disappeared under the waves. Never did the ships of a squadron maneuver with more unity. At that moment night fell suddenly, and the reeds, scarcely raised by the breeze, lay peaceably under the sides of the Nautilus. The next day, 26th of January, we cut the equator at the 82nd meridian and entered the northern hemisphere. During the day, a formidable troop of sharks accompanied us, terrible creatures, which multiply in the seas, and they make them very dangerous. They were Cestraceo philippi sharks, with brown backs and whitish bellies, armed with 11 rows of teeth. Eyed sharks, their teeth being marked with a large black spot surrounded with white like an eye. There were also some Isabella sharks, with rounded snouts marked with dark spots. These creatures, these powerful creatures often hurl themselves at the windows of the saloon with such violence as to make us feel very insecure. At such times, Ned Land was no longer master of himself. He wanted to go to the surface and harpoon the monsters, particularly certain smooth-hound sharks, whose mouth is studded with teeth like a mosaic, and large tiger sharks nearly 6 yards long, the last named of which seemed to excite him more particularly. But the Nautilus, accelerating her speed, easily left the most rapid of them behind. The 27th of January, at the entrance of the vast Bay of Bengal, we met repeatedly a forbidding spectacle. Dead bodies floating on the surface of the water. They were the dead of the Indian villages, carried by the gangs to the level of the sea, and which the vultures, the only undertakers of the country, had not been able to devour. But the sharks did not fail to help them at their funeral work. It's calming to hear you, Heathen. I'm glad. Um, mm, Glad to hear that. The 27th of... Oh, about 7 o'clock in the evening, the Nautilus, half immersed, was sailing in a sea of milk. At first sight, the ocean seemed lactified. Was it the effect of the lunar rays? No, for the moon, scarcely 2 days old, was still lying hidden under the horizon in the rays of the sun. The whole sky, though lit by sidereal rays, seemed black by contrast with the whiteness of the waters. Conseil would not believe his eyes, and questioned me as to the cause of this strange phenomenon. Happily, I was able to answer him. It is called a milk sea, I explained. A large extent of white wavelets, often to be seen on the coast of Amboyana and in these parts of the sea. But, sir, said Conseil, can you tell me what causes such an effect? For I suppose the water is not really turned into milk. No, my boy, and the whiteness which surprises you is caused only by the presence of myriads of infusoria, a sort of luminous little worm, gelatinous and without color, of the thickness of a hair, and whose length is not more than the 7,000th of an inch. These insects adhere to one another, sometimes for several leagues. Several leagues! Exclaimed Conseil. Yes, my boy, and you need not try to compute the number of these infusoria. You will not be able, for, if I am not mistaken, ships have floated on these milk seas for more than 40 miles. Towards midnight, the sea suddenly resumed its usual color, but behind us, even to the limits of the horizon, the sky reflected the whitened waves, and for a long time seemed impregnated with the vague glimmerings of an aurora borealis. Oh, an aurora. Nice. Chapter 2. a novel proposal of Captain Nemo's. On the 28th of February, when at noon the Nautilus came to the surface of the sea in 9 degrees 4 north latitude, there was land in sight about 8 miles to westward. The first thing I noticed was a range of mountains about 2,000 feet high, the shapes of which were most capricious. On taking the bearings, I knew that we were nearing the island of Ceylon. The pearl which hangs from the lobe of the Indian Peninsula. Captain Nemo and his second appeared at this moment. The captain glanced at the map, then, turning to me, said, "The island of Ceylon, noted for its pearl fisheries. Would you like to visit one of them, Mr. Aronnax?" "Certainly, Captain." "Well, the thing is easy. Though if we see the fisheries, we shall not see the fishermen. The annual exportation has not yet begun. Never mind. I will give orders to make for the Gulf of Mannar, where we shall arrive in the night." The captain said something to his second, who immediately went out. Soon the Nautilus returned to her native element, and the manometer showed that she was about 30 feet deep. "Well, sir," said Captain Nemo, "you and your companions shall visit the Bank of Mannar, and if by chance some fisherman should be there, we shall see him at work." "Agreed, Captain." By the way, Mr. Aronnax, you are not afraid of sharks?" "Sharks!" exclaimed I. This question seemed a very hard one. "Well," continued Captain Nemo, "I admit, Captain, that I am not yet very familiar with that kind of fish." "We are accustomed to them," replied Captain Nemo, "and in time you will be too. However, we shall be armed, and on the road we may be able to hunt some of the tribe. It is interesting. So, till tomorrow, sir, and early." This said in a careless tone, Captain Nemo left the saloon. "Now, if you were invited to hunt the bear in the mountains of Switzerland, what would you say?" "Very well, tomorrow we will go and hunt the bear." "If you were asked to hunt the lion in the plains of Atlas or the tiger in the Indian jungles, what would you say?" "Ha ha! It seems we are going to hunt the tiger or the lion." "But when you are invited to hunt the shark in its natural element, you would perhaps reflect before accepting the invitation." "True. As for myself," I passed my hand over my forehead, on which stood large drops of cold perspiration. "Let us reflect," said I, "and take our time. Hunting others in submarine forests, as we did in the island of Crespo, will pass, but going up and down at the bottom of the sea, where one is almost certain to meet sharks, is quite another thing. I know well that in certain countries, particularly in the Andaman Islands, the Negroes never hesitate to attack them with a dagger in one hand and a running noose on the other. But I also know that few affrontous creatures ever return alive. However, I am not a Negro, and if I were, I think a little hesitation in this case would not be ill-timed." That's true, they swim very fast. It is a disadvantage. At this moment, Consul and the Canadian entered. Quite composed and even joyous, they knew not what awaited them. "Faith, sir," said Ned Land, "your Captain Nemo, the devil take him, has just made us a very pleasant offer." "Ah," said I, "you know—" "If agreeable to you, sir," interrupted the consul, "the commander of the Nautilus has invited us to visit the magnificent Ceylon fisheries tomorrow, in your company. He did it kindly and behaved like a real gentleman. He said nothing more, sir, except that he had already spoken to you of this little walk." "Sir," said Consul, "would you give us some details of the pearl fishery?" "As to the fishing itself," I asked, "or the incidents, which?" "On the fishing," replied the Canadian. "Before entering upon the ground, it is as well to know something about it." "Very well. Sit down, my friends, and I will teach you." Ned and Consul seated themselves on an ottoman, and the first thing the Canadian asked was, "Sir, what is a pearl?" "My worthy Ned," I answered, "to the poet a pearl is a tear of the sea. To the Orientals it is a drop of dew solidified. To the ladies it is a jewel of an oblong shape, of a brilliance of mother-of-pearl substance, which they wear on their fingers, their necks, on their ears. For the chemist it is a mixture of phosphate and carbonate of lime with a little gelatin. And lastly, for naturalists, it is simply a morbid secretion of the organ that produces the mother-of-pearl among certain bivalves." "Branch of Mollusca," said Consul, "class of Acephali, order of Testacea." "Precisely so, my learned Consul, and amongst these Testacea, the earshell, the Tridacna, the turbots, in a word, all those which secrete mother-of-pearl, that is, the blue, bluish, violet, or white substance which lines the interior of their shells, are capable of producing pearls." "Mussels, too?" asked the Canadian. "Yes, mussels of certain waters in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Saxony, Bohemia, and France." "Good. For the future I shall pay attention," replied the Canadian. "But," I continued, "the particular mollusk which secretes the pearl is the pearl oyster, the Meleagrina margaritifera, that precious pintadine. The pearl is nothing but a nacreous formation, deposited in a globular form, either adhering to the oyster shell or buried in the folds of the creature. On the shell it is fast, in the flesh it is loose, but always has for a kernel a small hard substance, maybe a barren egg, or maybe a grain of sand, around which the pearl matter deposits itself year after year successively, and by thin concentric layers." "Are many pearls found in the oyster?" asked Consul. "Yes, my boy. There are some pintadines, a perfect casket. One oyster has been mentioned, though I allow myself to doubt it, as having contained no less than 150 sharks." "150 sharks!" exclaimed Ned Land. "Did I say sharks?" said I hurriedly. "I meant to say 150 pearls. Sharks would not be sense." "Certainly not," said Consul, "but we will tell you now by what means they extract those pearls." They proceed in various ways. When they adhere to the shell, the fishermen often pull them off with pincers, but the most common way is to lay the pintadines on mats of the seaweed which cover the banks. Thus they die in the open air, and at the end of 10 days they are in a forward state of decomposition. They are then plunged into large reservoirs of seawater. Then they are opened and washed. Now begins the double work of the sorters. First, they separate the layers of the pearl, known in commerce by the name of bastard whites and bastard blacks, which are delivered in boxes of 250 and 300 pounds each. Then they take the parenchyma of the oyster, boil it, and pass it through a sieve in order to extract the very smallest pearls. The price of these pearls varies according to their size? Asked Consul. Not only according to their size, I answered, but also according to their shape, their water, that is, their color, and their lustre, that is, that bright and diapered sparkle which makes them so charming to the eye. The most beautiful are called virgin pearls or paragons. They are formed alone in the tissue of the mollusk, are white, often opaque, and sometimes have the transparency of an opal. They are generally round or oval. The round are made into bracelets, the oval into pendants, and, being more precious, are sold singly. Those adhering to the shell of the oyster are more irregular in shape, and are sold by weight. Lastly, in a lower order are classed those small pearls known under the name of seed pearls. They are sold by measure, and are specially used in embroidery for church ornaments. But, said Consul, is the spear fishery dangerous? No, I answered quickly, particularly if certain precautions are taken. What does one risk in such a calling? Said Ned Land. The swallowing of some mouthfuls of seawater? As you say, Ned. By the way, said I, trying to take Captain Nemo's careless tone, are you afraid of sharks, brave Ned? I, replied the Canadian, a harpooner by profession. It is my trade to make light of them. But, said I, it is not a question of fishing for them with an iron swivel, hoisting them into the vessel, cutting off their tails with a blow of a chopper, ripping them up, and throwing their heart into the sea. Then it is a question of precisely in the water. In the water. Faith, a good harpoon. You know, sir, these sharks are ill-fashioned beasts. They must turn on their bellies to seize you, and in that time Ned Land had a way of saying seize, which made my blood run cold. Well, and you, Consul, what do you think of sharks? Me, said Consul. I will be frank, sir. So much the better, thought I. If you, sir, mean to face the sharks, I do not see why your faithful servant should not face them with you. Chapter 3. A Pair of 10 Millions. Oh, I wonder if they find a very special pearl. Let's continue. The next morning, at 4 o'clock, I was awakened by the steward, whom Captain Nemo had placed at my service. I rose, hurriedly dressed, and went into the saloon. Captain Nemo was awaiting me. "Mr. Aronnax," said he, "are you ready to start?" "I am ready." "Then please follow me." "And my companions, Captain?" "They have been told, and are waiting." "Are we not to put on our divers' dresses?" asked I. "Not yet. I have not allowed the Nautilus to come too near to this coast, and we are some distance from the Manar bank. But this boat is ready and will take us to the exact point of disembarking, which will save us a long way. It carries our diving apparatus, which we will put on when we begin our submarine journey." Captain Nemo conducted me to the central staircase, which led on the platform. Ned and Conseil were already there, delighted at the idea of the pleasure party which was preparing. 5 sailors from the Nautilus, with their oars, waited in the boat, which had been made fast against the side. The night was still dark. Layers of clouds covered the sky, allowing but a few stars to be seen. I looked on the side where the land lay, and saw nothing but a dark line enclosing 3 parts of the horizon, from southwest to northwest. The Nautilus, having returned during the night up the western coast of Ceylon, was now west of the bay, or rather gulf, formed by the mainland and the island of Manar. There, under the dark waters, stretched the Pintadin bank, an inexhaustible field of pearls, the length of which is more than 20 miles. Captain Nemo, Ned Land, Conseil, and I took our places in the stern of the boat. The master went to the tiller. His 4 companions leaned on their oars. The painter was cast off, and we cheered off. The boat went towards the south. The oarsmen did not hurry. I noticed that their strokes, strong in the water, only followed each other every 10 seconds, according to the method generally adopted in the Navy. Whilst the craft was running by its own velocity, the liquid drops struck the dark depths of the waves crisply, like spats of melted lead. A little below, spreading wide, gave a slight roll to the boat, and some samphire reeds flapped before it. We were silent. What was Captain Nemo thinking of? Perhaps of the island he was approaching, and which he found too near to him, contrary to the Canadian's opinion, who thought it too far off. As to Conseil, he was merely there from curiosity. Although 5:30, the first tints on the horizon showed the upper line of coast more distinctly. Flattened off in the east, it rose a little to the south. 5 miles still lay between us, and it was indistinct owing to the mist of the water. At 6 o'clock it became suddenly daylight, with that rapidity peculiar to tropical regions, which know neither dawn or twilight. The solar rays pierced the curtains of clouds, piled up on the eastern horizon, and the radiant orb rose rapidly. I saw land distinctly, with a few trees scattered here and there. The boat neared Manar Island, which was rounded to the south. Captain Nemo rose from his seat and watched the sea. At a sign from him, the anchor was dropped, but the chain scarcely ran. And this spot was one of the highest points of the bank of the Pintadines. "Here we are, Mr. Aronnax," said Captain Nemo. "You see that enclosed bay? Here, in a month, will be assembled the numerous fishing boats of the exporters, and these are the waters their divers will ransack so boldly. Happily, this bay is well situated for that kind of fishing. It is sheltered from the strongest winds, the sea is never very rough here, which makes it favorable for the divers' work. We will now put on our dresses and begin our walk." Check something. That's some music. There we go. So 29. I did not answer, and while watching the suspected waves, began with the help of the sailors to put on my heavy sea dress. Captain Nemo and my companions were also dressing. None of the Nautilus men were to accompany us in this new excursion. Soon we were enveloped to the throat in India rubber clothing. The air apparatus fixed to our backs by braces. As to the Ruhmkorff apparatus, there was no necessity for it. Before putting my head into the copper cap, I had asked the question of the captain. "They would be useless," we replied. "We are going to no great depth, and the solar rays will be enough to light our walk. Besides, it will not be prudent to carry the electric light in these waters. Its brilliancy might attract some of the dangerous inhabitants of the coast most inopportunely." As Captain Nemo pronounced these words, I turned to Conseil and Ned Land. But my two friends had already encased their heads in the metal cap, and they could neither hear nor answer. One last question remained to ask of Captain Nemo. "And our arms?" asked I. "Our guns?" "Guns? What for? Do not mountaineers attack the bear with a dagger in their hand? And is it not steel surer than lead? Here is a strong blade. Put it in your belt, and we start." I looked at my companions. They were armed like us, and more than that, Ned Land was brandishing an enormous harpoon, which he had placed in the boat before leaving the Nautilus. Just like him. Then, following the captain's example, I allowed myself to be dressed in the heavy copper helmet, and our reservoirs of air were at once in activity. An instant after we were landed, one after the other, in about 2 yards of water upon uneven sand, Captain Nemo made a sign with his hand, and we followed him by a gentle declivity till we disappeared under the waves. Over our feet, like coveys of snipe in a bog, rose shoals of fish of the genus Monoptera, which have no other fins but their tail. I recognized the Javanese, a real serpent 2.5 feet long, of a livid color underneath, and which might easily be mistaken for a conger eel if it were not for the golden stripes on its sides. In the genus Stromateus, whose bodies are very flat and oval, I saw some of the most brilliant colors, carrying their dorsal fin like a scythe, an excellent eating fish, which, dried and pickled, is known by the name of carawade. Then some tranquibars, belonging to the genus Apsiphorinoids, whose body is covered with a shell curious of 8 longitudinal plates. The heightening sun lit the mass of waters more and more. The soil changed by degrees. To the fine sand succeeded a perfect causeway of boulders covered with a carpet of mollusks and zoophytes. Amongst the specimens of these branches, I noticed some Plantacenae with thin, unequal shells, a kind of ostracion peculiar to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, some orange Lucinae with rounded shells, rockfish 3 feet and a half long, which raised themselves under the waves like hands ready to seize one. There were also some Panopyres, slightly luminous, and lastly some Oculines, like magnificent fans, forming one of the richest vegetations of these seas. In the midst of these living plants, and under the arbors of the hydrophytes, were layers of clumsy articulates, particularly some Raminae, whose carapace formed a slightly rounded triangle. Sorry. There are also, in the midst of these living plants, and under the arbors of the hydrophytes, were layers of clumsy articulates, particularly some Reninae, whose carapace formed a slightly rounded triangle, and some horrible-looking Parthenops. At about 7 o'clock we found ourselves at last surveying the oyster banks. Or on which the pearl oysters are reproduced by millions. Captain Nemo pointed with his hand to the enormous heap of oysters, and I could well understand that this mine was inexhaustible, for nature's creative power is far beyond man's instinct of destruction. Ned Land, faithful to his instinct, hastened to fill a net which he carried to his side with some of the finest specimens. But we could not stop. We must follow the captain, who seemed to guide himself by paths known only to himself. The ground was sensibly rising, and sometimes, on holding up my arm, it was above the surface of the sea. Then the level of the bank would sink capriciously. Often we rounded wry rocks scarped into pyramids. In their dark fractures, huge crustacea perched upon their high claws like some war machines, watched us with fixed eyes, and under our feet crawled various kinds of annelids. At this moment there were opened before us a large grotto. In a picturesque heap of rocks, and carpeted with all the thick warp of the submarine flora. At first it seemed very dark to me. The solar rays seemed to be extinguished by successive gradations, until its vague transparency became nothing more than a drowned light. Captain Nemo entered. We followed. My eyes soon accustomed themselves to this relative state of darkness. I could distinguish the arches springing capriciously from natural pillars, standing broad upon their granite base, like the heavy columns of Tuscan architecture. Why had their incomprehensible guide led us to the bottom of the submarine crypt? I was soon to know. After descending in a rather sharp declivity, our feet trod at the bottom in a kind of circular pit. There, Captain Nemo stopped and with his hand indicated an object I had not yet perceived. It was an oyster of extraordinary dimensions, a gigantic tridacne, a goblet which could have contained a whole lake of holy water, a basin the breadth of which was more than 2 yards and a half, and consequently larger than that ornamenting the saloon of the Nautilus. I approached this extraordinary mollusk. It adhered by its species to a table of granite, and there, isolated, it developed itself in the calm waters of the grotto. I estimated the weight of this tridacne at 600 pounds. Such an oyster would contain 30 pounds of meat, and one must have the stomach of a gargantua to demolish some dozens of them. Captain Nemo was evidently acquainted with the existence of this bivalve and seemed to have a particular motive in verifying the actual state of this tridacne. The shells were a little open. The captain came near and put his dagger between to prevent them from closing. Then, with his hand, he raised the membrane with its fringed edges, which formed a cloak for the creature. There, between the folded plates, I saw a loose pearl, whose size equaled that of a cocoa nut. Its globular shape, perfect clearness, and admirable luster made it altogether a jewel of inestimable value. Carried away by my curiosity, I stretched out my hand to seize it, weigh it, and touch it. But the captain stopped me, made a sign of refusal, and quickly withdrew the dagger, and the two shells closed suddenly. I then understood Captain Nemo's intention. In leaving this pearl hidden in the mantle of the Tridacne, he was allowing it to grow slowly. Each year, the secretions of the mollusk would add new concentric circles. I estimated its value at 500,000 pounds at euros at least. After 10 minutes, Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. I thought he had halted previously to returning. No, but by a gesture he bade us crouch beside him in a deep fracture of the rock. His hand pointed to one part of the liquid mass, which I watched attentively. About 5 yards from me a shadow appeared and sank to the ground. The disquieting idea of sharks shot through my mind, but I was mistaken, and once again it was not a monster of the ocean that we had anything to do with. It was a man, a living man, an Indian, a fisherman, a poor devil who, I suppose, had come to glean before the harvest. I could see the bottom of his canoe anchored some feet above his head. He dived and went up successfully. A stone held between his feet, cut in the shape of a sugar loaf, whilst the rope fastened him to his boat, helped him to descend more rapidly. This was all his apparatus. Reaching the bottom about 5 yards deep, he went on his knees and filled his bag with oysters, picked up at random. Then he went up, emptied it, pulled up his stone, and began the operation once more, which lasted 30 seconds. The diver did not see us. The shadow of the rock hid us from sight. And how should this poor Indian ever dream that men, beings like himself, should be there under the water, watching his movements and losing no detail of the fishing? Several times he went up in this way and dived again. He did not carry away more than 10 at each plunge, for he was obliged to pull them from the bank to which they adhered by means of their strong byssus. And how many of those oysters for which he risked his life had no pearl in them? I watched him closely. His manoeuvres were irregular, and for the space of half an hour no danger appeared to threaten him. I was beginning to accustom myself to the sight of this interesting fishing, when suddenly, as the Indian was on the ground, I saw him make a gesture of terror, rise, and make a spring to return to the surface of the sea. I understood his dread. A gigantic shadow appeared just above this unfortunate diver. It was a shark of enormous size advancing diagonally, his eyes on fire and his jaws open. I was mute with horror and unable to move. The voracious creature shot towards the Indian, who threw himself on one side in order to avoid the shark's fins, but not its tail, for it struck his chest and stretched him on the ground. The scene lasted but a few seconds. The shark returned, and, turning on his back, prepared himself for cutting the Indian in two, and I saw Captain Nemo rise suddenly, and then, dagger in hand, walk straight to the monster, ready to fight face to face with him. the very moment the shark was going to snap the unhappy fisherman in two, he perceived this new adversary, and turning over, made straight towards him. I can still see Captain Nemo's position. Holding himself well together, he waited for the shark with admirable coolness, and when it rushed at him, threw himself on one side with wonderful quickness, avoiding the shock and burying his dagger deep in its side. But it was not all over. A terrible combat ensued. The shark had seemed to roar, if I might say so. The blood rushed in torrents from its wound, the sea was dyed red, and through the opaque liquid I could distinguish nothing more. Nothing more, until the moment when, like lightning, I saw the undaunted captain hanging on to one of the creature's fins, struggling, as it were, hand to hand with the monster, and dealing successful blows at his enemy, yet still unable to give a decisive one. The shark's struggles agitated the water with such fury that the rocking threatened to upset me. I wanted to go to the captain's assistance, but, nailed to the spot with horror, I could not stir. I saw the haggard eye, I saw the different phases of the fight. The captain fell to the earth, upset by the enormous mass which leant upon him. The shark's jaws opened wide, like a pair of factory shears, and it would have been all over with the captain, but, quick as thought, harpoon in hand, Ned Land rushed towards the shark and struck it with its sharp point. The waves were impregnated with a mass of blood. They rocked under the shark's movements, which beat them with undescribable fury. Ned Land had not missed his aim. It was the monster's death rattle. Struck to the heart, it struggled in dreadful convulsions, the shock of which overthrew Conseil. But Ned Land had disentangled the captain, who, getting up without any wound, went straight to the Indian, quickly cut the cord which held him to his stone, took him in his arms, and, with a sharp blow to his heel, mounted to the surface. We all three followed in a few seconds, saved by a miracle, and reached the fisherman's boat. Hi there, welcome. Captain Nemo's first care was to recall the unfortunate man to life again. I did not think he could succeed. I hoped so, for the poor creature's immersion was not long, but the blow from the shark's tail might have been his death blow. Happily, with the captain and Conseil's sharp friction, I saw consciousness return by degrees. He opened his eyes. What was his surprise? What was his surprise, his terror even, at seeing four great copperheads leaning over him, and, above all, what must he have thought when Captain Nemo, drawing from the pocket of his dress a bag of pearls, placed it in his hand? This magnificent charity from the man of the waters to the poor Cingalese was accepted with a trembling hand. His wondering eyes showed that he knew not to what superhuman beings he owed both fortune and life. At a sign from the captain, we regained the bank, and, following the road already traversed, came in about half an hour to the anchor which held the canoe of the Nautilus to the earth. Once on board, we each, with the help of the sailors, got rid of the heavy copper helmet. Captain Nemo's first word was to the Canadian. "Thank you, Master Land," said he. "It was in revenge, Captain," replied Ned Land. "I owed you that." A ghastly smile passed across the captain's lips, and that was all. "To the Nautilus," said he. The boat flew over the waves. Some minutes later, we met the shark's dead body floating. By the black marking of the extremity of its fins, I recognized the terrible Melanopteron of the Indian seas, of the species of shark properly so called. It was more than 25 feet long. Its enormous mouth occupied 1/3 of its body. It was an adult, as was known by its 6 rows of teeth placed in an isosceles triangle in the upper jaw. Conseil looked at it with scientific interest, and I am sure that he placed it, and not without reason, in the cartilaginous class of the Chondropterygian order, with fixed gills, of the Selacian family in the genus of the sharks. Whilst I was contemplating this inert mass, a dozen of those voracious beasts appeared round the boat, and, without noticing us, threw themselves upon the dead body and fought with one another over the pieces. At 8:30 we were again on board the Nautilus. There I reflected on the incidents which had taken place in our excursion off the Mannar Bank. That was a quite dangerous event indeed. Two conclusions I must inevitably draw from it. One bearing upon the unparalleled courage of Captain Nemo, the other upon his devotion to a human being, a representative of that race from which he fled beneath the sea. Whatever he might say, this strange man had not yet succeeded in entirely crushing his heart. When I made this observation to him, he answered in a slightly moved tone. "That Indian, sir, is an inhabitant of an oppressed country, and I am still, and shall be, to my last breath, one of them." Oh, so his nationality is finally. I see. I wonder if he has some bad past in there that made him hate the rest of the world. I think I'm a little tired today, so I'll end it here. But we shall continue on the next Sunday. And tomorrow I will play a new game. I will be playing Dofus. And if anyone, I think it is a multiplayer game. So if anyone wants to play with me, I will be taking on adventures to come. So this will be it for today. I hope it was enjoyable. And until next Sunday or until tomorrow, we'll be reading more. Maybe you'll finally discover some of the captain's past. This is getting interesting. Bye. Let me see if there is anyone for us to raid. See. I don't see. I don't see anyone online. So I guess maybe someone else reading a book, but I'd have to find it. So I just end it here. Or let me just. I actually don't see anyone. No, so this is it. Thank you everyone for watching. See you next time.